English Daily. Okay. And as a journalist, she has focused extensively on politics, conflict, human rights in Jammu and Kashmir in her area. And her work has been published in various Indian and international newspapers, magazines, periodicals, and anthologies. She is an executive member of the Pakistan-India People's Forum for Peace and Democracy, which was launched in the 1990s, which is where I know her from back in the 1990s. And she's also an active member of the South Asians for Human Rights. In 2019, she petitioned India's top court against the communication and media blockade in Kashmir, which is actually still going on, but slightly partially lifted. Anuradha was a Commonwealth Fellow in 2016 and is currently a Knight Fellow at Stanford University. So the way we are going to do this, I've already introduced Anuradha, but I forgot to mention that the way we are structuring this discussion is that each of the panelists will have 5 minutes to situate the issue they're talking about. And then I know that there are some people, some journalists online that I will ask them to say a few comments before we open it up to the audience. So first of all, if we could have Anuradha on Spotlighted, and if Anu, you could come on, and I'll give you a heads up if you start running over your 5 minutes.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Thank you, Beena. I didn't think I would be the first one.
I sent an email. You should read your email.
Yeah, okay. Oh, sorry. But anyway, I mean, today we are sitting here to discuss the challenges that journalists and journalism is facing around the globe, and particularly in South Asia. And the South Asian situation is pretty worrying. If you look at the rankings, the press freedom rankings, and how they're going diving down, and particularly in the Indian case, I am looking at the graph in the last 10 years. It's pretty shocking. But I would first of all like to focus on Kashmir, where I have been working, and then look at the larger issues that are pretty much common. In Kashmir, journalism has always been under threat because of the peculiar nature of the politics of the region. And of the tendency of the governments to control the narrative. And it has become harder. It became harder when insurgency started in the 1990s, when journalists were caught between the two guns on the two sides, the state actors and the militants. And particularly in the last 1 decade, and more so post 2019, it's become not just harder for the journalists to function. It is becoming nearly impossible for them to continue their work, because the government is now employing a mixed bag of harsh censorship and covert censorship to prevent any kind of critical voices coming out in the public domain. So there's very little that you hear today about Kashmir that is critical. They have a full arsenal of mixed kind of things that they're using against journalists. I mean, there was an internet shutdown, which impeded, among many other things, the work of the journalists. There is excessive surveillance. And if for prolonged periods, there is surveillance on journalists, there is prolonged internet shutdown, it makes the journalists not just powerless, it also induces an element of fear. Ever since there is a policy by the government of the government agencies to continuously summon journalists, interrogate them, intimidate them if their reports are critical of the government. There is complete intolerance to even a critical word. In the last 1 year, about 5 journalists have been arrested, and kind of pushed into that vortex of what we call revolving door arrests. Some were earlier jailed and released. There are a dozen other journalists who are facing criminal cases. Journalists are being put on no-fly lists. So the amount of reportage from Kashmir is reducing bit by bit. And as far as the news organizations are concerned, there's still a lot of reliance on the flawed model of reliance on the government subsidies. And so news organizations, in a bid to save their businesses, which eventually are not really saying anything, they are kind of falling for the bait. And other reporters or freelance journalists or those working for national media, international media, there is a bid to convert them into stenographers and impose a silence that is frightening and pushing journalism towards extinction. And now this experiment is also being extended to rest of India, I'm afraid so, and it's though it's not sustainable. You know, right now it's working. It's imposed a certain fear. It has decimated all the voices of criticism. It has reduced information. It has reduced the voices of the marginalized, which the journalists should be bringing. But I don't think this kind of a model can be sustainable for long. And if I look at, you know, all over South Asia and maybe even in the world, there are similar things that we are all facing. I mean, journalists are being targeted through physical intimidation, through harassment, through criminal cases, and the entire industry of journalism. There are issues of sustainability, which are often linked with the way the state is targeting news industry. We need to, so the questions that we really need to ask ourselves is, one, how do we create safe environment for journalists? Number two, what are the good financial revenue models for news organizations? I mean, there is a lot of introduction of, say, these not-for-profit news organizations, which have a subscription-based model, or some do-gooder investing some money as part of philanthropy. But the question really is of, I'll just take another minute. The question really is of the outreach. Can they match the outreach of the bigger news organizations? I mean, recently we've seen like the NDTV take over by the corporate, and that's happened at the behest of the government. A lot of good journalists are leaving the organization. Maybe they set up something new, but can that new thing have the same kind of an outreach? The third thing that we are dealing with is disinformation. There is a flooding of disinformation. And this is not just making it harder for us to put out information there in the public domain, it is also confusing the reader. And there are issues of trust that we need to think about how to address that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I know that you brought up some really important points. You know, about the mixed bag of tricks that are being employed and the pattern that you've identified, which, as you said, is available. It's not just in South Asia, I would say, around the world. With that point that these are similar patterns we are seeing around the world, and the disinformation campaign and all that. And I'll come around to all the panelists again and give you all a little bit of more time as well. But for now, I would like to invite Steve Butler to speak. Steve is a senior program. All journalists in South Asia know Steve because CPJ, or the Committee to Protect Journalists, is one of the first to speak up about oppression against journalists in our region. Steve is the senior program consultant for the CPJ, and which he joined in 2016 as Asia program coordinator. He was earlier foreign correspondent, reporting from Asia for nearly 20 years, including South Korea in the mid-1980s and the Christian Science Monitor and the Financial Times. He has reported for the Financial Times from Southeast Asia, London, and Tokyo, where he lived for a decade. And he made regular reporting visits to China. And China is another, I think, a region that we must mention because of its effect on the world. Steve has also been foreign editor at Knight Ridder's Washington Bureau during the US wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And he holds a PhD in political science from Columbia University. I'd like to ask Steve to be put on the spotlight. If Steve, you could take just 5 minutes to situate. And also I forgot to mention, and of course, maybe you can talk about this a little bit. When you were in Pakistan recently for the Asma Jahangir conference, you made the news by being detained for no less than 8 hours. And this was the second time that you were detained in Pakistan. What that says about the whole situation. So if you could, handing over to you.
Oh, sure. Thank you very much, Bina. And thank you everyone for tuning in. I want to try to set this in a bigger context, which is to say that we are in the midst of a worldwide competition between democracy and autocracy. Press freedom is at the very heart of this struggle because you can't have democracy without press freedom. It's difficult to overemphasize that basic tenet. The struggle for press freedom is the struggle for democracy. 10 to 15 years ago, I think we were all very naive, thinking the internet would enhance democracy by opening access to information and giving everyone a voice. But China initially proved this wrong. They took on the challenge and managed to impose ever stricter controls over information than traditional censorship had achieved. It took an army of digital censors and a lot of technology, but it has basically succeeded. The recent demonstrations against zero COVID policies shows that information control is not 100% effective, but I think this basic model remains intact. Other countries have learned from this, but also taken somewhat different directions. In the Philippines, the free press has been undermined by a flood of disinformation believed to come from sources closely affiliated with the government of former President Rodrigo Duterte. Maria Ressa, the Nobel Prize winner, has been extremely vocal about this. She has eloquently argued that lies repeated ad infinitum become accepted as truth by many, and that democracy becomes impossible without a common acceptance of basic facts. This is clearly an issue in the United States as well. In the Philippines and elsewhere, we see the egregious use of cybercrime laws to thwart journalists. Bangladesh is a key offender here with its digital security law that has ensnared dozens of journalists who may be disappeared, arrested, or in the case of Mustaq Ahmed, die in prison. The Bangladesh government has a poor record of following due process in these cases, and even when freed on bail, journalists face an uncertain future as these cases continue to drag on for years, unresolved by the courts, requiring them to make multiple court appearances where little is accomplished and running up expensive legal bills. The government is increasingly going after journalists in exile, filing charges against them under the Digital Security Act, and sometimes harassing or even jailing relatives who reside in the country. This has obviously had a huge impact on the ability of Bangladesh media to report the news. Even though there is really a distinguished past in that industry. In India, the abuse of sedition laws and charges of offending religious sensitivities have ensnared many journalists. And when police are unable to stop courts from granting bail, they may often slap additional charges or change jurisdictions to keep journalists successfully behind bars. And in these cases, the local governments are even managing to thwart efforts by the Supreme Court to get journalists out of jail. This is, as previously mentioned, this is a tactic frequently used in Kashmir to silence journalists. Pakistan is a more complicated case because of the high degree of political fragmentation and the powerful role of the military and security agencies, which may not be on the same page as the nominally elected government. Pakistani journalists are more frequently killed than jailed, and it's nearly impossible to find out who's behind it or why, even if it seems clear who had motivation to do so. The elected government is often powerless to counteract the activities of the security agencies. And this is what I discovered, of course. I was detained by the Federal Investigation Agency at the Lahore airport. The Federal Investigation Agency is technically under the jurisdiction of the Interior Ministry, which issued me my visa. And they had assured the sponsors of the conference that I was no longer on their no entry list. I actually ended up being freed from the airport after the Prime Minister and the Interior Minister both intervened, although we can talk about this later, but that the harassment continued, even after I managed to get into the country. If we look at the bookends to the region, Afghanistan and Myanmar, we find very different situations. Fortunately, in Afghanistan, the killing of journalists appears to have come to a halt, and long-term jailing of journalists has not occurred. But harassment of journalists and news operations has picked up as the media industry has shrunk drastically, while hundreds, perhaps thousands of journalists have fled the country in fear of the Taliban and just out of a sense of pessimism about their own future. Myanmar may have the most brutal regime in the region as far as journalists are concerned. It is holding 50 or more journalists in jail, which likely this year will make it the country or the first or the worst or the second worst jailer of journalists in the world. It is in competition with Iran for that title. CPJ's annual report on jailed journalists will be released on December 14th. And I think China will be a bit relieved that they are no longer the #1 jailer. I'll stop there. Thank you, Bina.
Thank you so much, Steve, for that very comprehensive overview. I think as I mentioned, we talked about China, and it's very appropriate that you brought up Bangladesh, that you dwelt on Bangladesh for some time, because our next speaker is from Bangladesh. And I think I'm really glad that you mentioned the bookends of Afghanistan and Myanmar, because the fact that the killings of journalists may have stopped in Afghanistan, but partly that's because journalism is almost at a halt in Afghanistan. So it's very ironic. And the journalists being in jail in Myanmar is something that the world needs to take more note of. I'm going to now ask Sabiha, who is sitting here with me in person, Sheikh Sabiha Alam. He's an award-winning reporter for the daily Tomorrow in Bangladesh, and she's based in Dhaka. She's a Lehman Fellow this year, which is how I came to know her. She writes on crime, terrorism, human rights, and politics. So as a crime reporter, it's I think difficult to be a crime reporter in any case, but to be a woman crime reporter is in a very, very male-dominated field is really very difficult indeed. And I applaud Sabiha for her work. She has worked for the BBC besides Bangladesh's other media in Bangladesh, and has won awards for her work. Besides the Press Trust of India Award and an award from the Counter-Terrorism and Transnational Crime Unit of the Dhaka Metropolitan Police. So I hand it over now to you, Sabiha.
Thank you, Bina, for your generous introduction.
You have 5 minutes. Go ahead.
The Constitution of the People's Republic of Bangladesh guarantees the right of every citizen to freedom of speech and expression and freedom of the press. And newspapers played a major role during the Liberation War in 1971. They were quite vocal and eventually paid the price. The Daily Ittifaq, the Daily Shongbad, and the Daily People sustained mortar attacks during Liberation War. Several other newspapers were attacked, and a portion of the press club was destroyed. But soon after the independence, in 1973, the Printing and Publication Act came into being, which empowered the district magistrates to give permission for publication of any newspaper or cancel their declaration. Later in 1975, the then government banned all except 4 state-sponsored newspapers, and subsequent governments, regardless of their forms, say democracy, full, semi, hybrid, autocracy, or authoritarian regime, persistently tried to squeeze the freedom of the press. Bangladeshi media, to my consideration, as Steve Butler said, is facing challenges. One of them is repressive laws, the Digital Security Act, and media ownership by the businessmen come lawmakers. None of the governments took initiative to revoke the Official Secrets Act 1923, Rather, we have witnessed the formulation of few other repressive laws, which effectively stopped the free flow of information and limited the scope for journalism in Bangladesh. The Section 57 of the Information and Communication Technology Act 2006 caused huge uproar among people, and the government promised the clauses which prompted the misuse would be replaced in the new law. But what we saw in the Digital Security Act, that it kept all those ambiguous clauses intact. In 2014, the government passed the National Broadcast Policy, and based on the recommendations of the policy, formulated the Draft Broadcast Act. And here we see the act incorporated provisions of 3 months jail term for the journalists and a fine of up to $50,000. Dozens of journalists fall prey to the Digital Security Act in Bangladesh in recent years. I must mention the arrest of cartoonist Ahmed Kabir Kishore. The law enforcement agency allegedly picked him up from his home, kept him in an unidentified location for 69 hours, severely beat him up, and before sending him to the court. And one of his casemates, Mushtaq Ahmed, died in prison. He was waiting for trial for 9 months. Last year, police arrested Rozana Islam, special correspondent of the Daily Pratham Alo, on charges of stealing documents under the Penal Code of 1860 and the Official Secrets Act 1923. But on top of these two incidents, there are many more incidents of abuse happening across the country. When the victim is from outside the capital, it's more likely that the incidents will be overlooked. A journalist in Noakhali, Burhanuddin Muzakkir, shot dead while covering a clash between two rival groups of the ruling party. I don't see regular follow-ups about this murder. Or Ghulam Sarwar, a Chittagong-based journalist, was kidnapped, remained missing for over a week. He had to quit journalism and silently left the country for the Middle East. He earns so little that it's not even enough for him. And his wife and children, who are still in Bangladesh, find it difficult to survive. There are incidences of intense surveillance over journalists. I'm a victim of such an incident. My conversation with my dad on a sensitive issue was leaked last year, and we were talking about some happenings at that time. I filed a general daily shortly after my conversation was leaked. It's more than a year. Nobody from the police department ever pinged me or talked with me for a single piece of information. I want to add, only the law enforcement agencies have the interception missions. And the acceptance of journalists to people in need has gone down drastically in recent times. Lawmakers, business groups own most of the media outlets. Media owners, except a few, routinely use the newsroom for their business interest. And they publish or broadcast biased and often fabricated news. I talked with some of my colleagues to know the type of pressures they come across daily. They alleged the high-ups of the newsrooms get calls from the quote-unquote high-ups for taking down specific news items. When one news outlet competes with another, not for journalism, but for business, journalism gets chopped. What we witness now in most cases is a competition among news outlets to woo the government. Moreover, our media often fail to go beyond party lines. And in some cases, especially during the rule of the military-backed government, Bangladeshi media published unsubstantiated documents provided by the intelligence agencies too. People are withdrawing their trust from the mainstream media and rest it on Facebook and other social media platforms. I'm afraid we will continue to see the democratic backsliding in Bangladesh.
Thank you, Sabina.
Thank you.
Sorry for that very dire picture that you painted, and sorry for the surveillance and the kind of oppression that you are facing, that all colleagues are facing in general. This is, like you said, like all the speakers have said, these kind of tactics we are seeing around in different parts of the world, and especially in South Asia. I'd like to now call on Kathy Kiley to talk about her experience and share her insights. And Kathy, particularly, we were interested in getting to speak because she's been following the case of Maria Ressa, who's, as I mentioned before, her hold the line, the term comes from Maria Ressa. Kathy is the Lee Hills Chair in Free Press Studies at the University of Missouri School of Journalism, where she supervises research and programming on press freedom. She has worked for over 40 years, doesn't look it, as a reporter and editor for regional and national newspapers in the USA, besides online and multimedia publications. She was also a Knight Fellow at Stanford, like Anuradha is now, and the National Press Club's inaugural Press Freedom Fellow, when she helped to organize to free the Mexican journalist and asylum seeker Emilio Gutierrez Soto from immigration detention. And this is also very interesting that in 2019, she inaugurated Friends of Facts, Friends of the Facts, a news literacy fair at Mizzou at the University of Missouri. She holds a master's degree from American University and an undergraduate degree from Princeton University, where she also now serves as a trustee. And Maria Ressa, of course, is also from Princeton, which is, I guess, where your connection is from, Kathy. So over to you, if in 5 minutes you could pull together some of these threads and talk not just about Maria Ressa's case in particular, but also the Mexican case, because we haven't talked about that. And that's another playbook we are seeing around the world.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Bina, and your colleagues in Boston for organizing this event. I think it's really important because to pick up on one of the things Steve said, we are in a world war. And the world war in most places doesn't involve bullets yet, but the weapon of choice is disinformation. And the press is on the front lines of that world war because, as several of the speakers have noted, democracy is impossible without a free press and without the people having the kind of fact-based information and impartial information they need to make intelligent decisions about their government. So I do have a broad view of this, and I guess from where I sit, and I guess it's not good news, but this misery has a lot of company. All of the things you are describing are happening not just in South Asia, but all over the world. And it's like there's a dictator's handbook that's getting passed around, and we see the same tactics popping up again and again. And that's why I think meetings like this are really important, because it's important for people who believe in democracy and believe in free speech and freedom of thought to start to develop our own handbook and to be as nimble as the bad guys are. And that is why I think Maria Ressa has been so important in this cause, and also so much of a target. Because as Steve noted, she has been one of the earliest to really recognize these trends, and also one of the most outspoken about them. And I really highly recommend her book, which I am in the midst of reading and hope to be teaching some of my students next semester how to stand up to a dictator. It's just out. It's fantastic. It really synthesizes a lot of her findings over the past couple of years. And if nothing else, I know a lot, it's really easy to get discouraged, but this will reignite your passion for what we all do, because when you see Maria's intelligence and bravery and grace, it's bound to make you want to carry her pencil, which is what I feel like I've been doing. I have organized a number of campaigns on the part of her fellow Princetonians for Maria. And one of the things that I think is remarkable about this is how quickly really prominent people fell into line, and how early in 2020 to start activating and agitating on her behalf. And we even got the late George Shultz. One of the last things he did at Public Acts before he died was to sign a petition for Maria. This was a former Secretary of State for Ronald Reagan, a Republican. But I think what that showed, and one of my partners in this venture in helping getting Princetonians together to help Maria, was Mike McCurry, a Democratic press secretary. But I said to Mike at the time, he was the White House press secretary for Bill Clinton. And I said, when we saw all these people so quickly volunteering to sign our letter, I said, you know what that shows, Mike? That smart people who are really aware of what's going on in the world understand the danger here, and they understand it's time to take a stand. So that is the good news. The bad news is that the Dictator's Handbook has proven to be pretty effective. And, you know, Maria Ressa is in danger of, she's facing a very potentially very long jail term. Her case is now before the Supreme Court of the Philippines. And what it shows you is that even winning a Nobel Peace Prize does not immunize you against the kind of harassment and danger that a lot of the other panelists have been describing. And so I think that leaves it to us to try to figure out what can we do, how can we mobilize in a way that that is going to be effective against that. And, you know, that is an uncomfortable thing for journalists. But I'm going to go back to another thing Maria says, which is in the war on facts, journalists must be activists. And I'm going to end it there, but I'm eager to hear and participate in the discussion.
Thank you so much, Kathy, for that wonderful synopsis and going over it. We didn't talk very much about the Mexican thing, but I think what the Dictator's Handbook that you mentioned.
Yeah, we can. Sorry. Yes, we can do that.
That's all right. But I also do want to. We have some of our other colleagues online. I see Namrata Sharma in Nepal, Fahim Abid from Afghanistan, who is who is also a Neiman Fellow here with Sabiha, and Ashish Dixit, who is also a Neiman Fellow from India, here with as Neiman Fellow. So I would like to take advantage of having these three brilliant journalists online with us. So I'm going to ask them just to say for a minute or two, just to add anything, to add their thoughts to what we've heard so far, and then I'm going to go down to the panelists again and ask you all about the mistakes. And I would like us all to actually think about this, the mistakes that we make, that journalists make, and how do we hold the line? I think to be more specific about how do we hold the line. So Namrata, if you can speak, I know your video isn't very good, but you can say something about the situation in Nepal, that would be great.
Hello, can I be heard, Bina?
Yes, you are absolutely loud and clear, Namrata. I'm going to spotlight for the.
Okay. Hello, everybody from Kathmandu. Thank you, Bina, for giving me this opportunity. I've been listening to the speakers earlier, and actually, I was just reflecting in my mind. You know, in Nepal, the freedom of press was established in 1990 after the restoration of democracy, and the leaders and the political parties who joined hands to bring about the restoration of democracy and set freedom of press for the first time through the absolute monarchy, and have brought Nepal to a federal state now, you know, a federal republic country. But it's very interesting, when I was listening to all of your reflections earlier, you know, Nepal had absolute monarchy, and of course there was complete control of the press by the state in the panchayat system before 1990. But now, with all the political parties, the Democratic Political Party, Nepali Congress, and then, as you know, in Nepal, when elsewhere communism was dying, the communism's left party started coming up very strongly. But unfortunately, what has happened over the years from 1990 till 2022 is there has been a very unseen way of controlling the press. You know, earlier there was only the state controlling the press. Now there is the state, but also slowly after 1990, the private sector press has started coming up, which has now become corporatized, like all over the world, you see. So what has happened is, so how has the control of press come about? You know, in Nepal, we don't hear cases of journalists being killed every day or put into prison for long terms. But in the name of sovereignty, what has happened is the democratic and progressive and liberal have started, in the name of quote unquote sovereignty of the country, bringing in laws under that name, under that clause in the constitution that to protect the sovereignty, you can do blah, blah, blah.
Right.
So now that there's the digital
Yes.
Journalism increasing a lot, so the digital act is coming, like the
Right.
speaker from Bangladesh was saying.
Yeah,
So
like what you had said, yeah.
cartoonists have been controlled over here. People singing songs have been had to withdraw in the from the YouTube, and also during the COVID, there was cases of corruption in bringing medicine and all that. So, the government actually withdraw a news from one of the news portal. And I think that was the time, there was a time when Steve also we together brought out a press release and all that. So
Right.
there is this unknown way of, I like the way you mentioned, Steve, democracy and autocracy, So where do we draw a line, So, and also the most important thing is, in Nepal, there are the Center for Investigative Journalism, where I was the president, just immediate past president, and I'm the advisor there now. We brought out an investigative story saying that there are 5 contractors in Nepal who control the overall construction business in the country. And they are all protected by different political party and political leaders. You see, so now as the press is being corporatized, where does the advertisements come from? Where does it go to? It all goes to those who are protected and those who can be trusted by whoever, you see.
Right.
So the freedom of press is questioned there, and the survival of real independent press is a big threat in Nepal too. So
Right.
although, I don't think it is necessary just to kill journalists or
Right.
put them in long-term prison, there's a fear. And also in a country like Nepal, those journalists who are just coming up slowly, younger journalists, there are
Yes.
threats now, according to Digital Act and other provisions, that you can be fined for 2 lakh rupees, 200,000 rupees or something like that. So where will the
Yeah, so
get the
you-
money to give that
you-
fine, you see?
Yeah.
So there's a censorship within the journalist also
Right.
that has created because of the fear
sort of a self-censorship as well. And
as well.
And as Kathy Kali has written in the chat, that the 2021 Nobel Peace Prize winners might represent what you are talking about, that there's the old-fashioned repression, the Russian journalist Dmitry, and the kind of thing that Maria Ressa is facing in the unseen way.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's one more thing I wanted to add, Bina, if it's okay.
Just very quickly,
As the
ma'am.
digital threats are coming, can I just add
Yes.
one more thing?
Please.
What has been seen is journalists are under threat and harassment digitally in social
Yes.
media, but women journalists are more at threat.
Mhm.
There is sexual harassment, literally trolling and otherwise digitally more in Nepal on
Yes.
women.
Not just Nepal, Namrata, around the world,
I think around the world, exactly.
the sexual nature of this kind of trolling of women journalists particularly, and the women, I know the women journalists in Pakistan have really taken this up very strongly, and others as well.
Absolutely.
So thank you for highlighting those very important points that are in addition to what we already have. And the point about cartoonists and singers, I think, was a very important one, because as we've seen, the Dictator's Handbook isn't just about journalists, it's about all cultural repression. So Fahim, Agit from Afghanistan, if you're around, if you can say a few words about your situation. I know you can't go back, and you're a Neiman Fellow here at Harvard right now. I think, Fahim, are you still there, or have you gone? He's gone?
Yes, I'm
There you-
here.
yes, there you are. There you are. So yeah, if you can just say a few words, Fahim. Thank you so much for joining, even if it's online, though you could have been here with us in person, but thank you for joining online. And if you can just say a few words to add to what people have said here.
Unfortunately, currently in Afghanistan, we don't have independent press, and a terrorist group is in charge of the country in the result of neglect of US and the way they run the peace talks or the surrender talks or the withdrawal deal with the Taliban, and they left the country, everything collapses the Taliban. So now the only hope for people is journalists in exile. We are trying to cover issues in Afghanistan from outside. there is very limited access, and people who we talk with, they are mostly chased back by the Taliban for talking with international media. And media is so much restricted now. The Taliban banned BBC and Voice of America in Afghanistan, and like even their Pashto and Dari service is not available anymore. So people are just trying to get their information online and listen to these platforms online. So situation is very bad, and there is no response to if we are trying to get comments on anything. The Taliban think that they know how to do everything the right way, but like unfortunately there is no hope for a better future and for an independent press in Afghanistan currently. But we as diaspora journalists try our best, and we are trying to uh, at least get some attention to the situation in Afghanistan, and hope that the international community and world would address the situation in the country, and there would be some changes to let people breathe.
Yeah, to let people breathe. That's such a poignant phrase, Fahim. Thank you so much. And highlight the importance of the diaspora journalists, I think, in cases like Afghanistan. Also, I think in Iran, and I think we can also mention, nobody ever mentioned Saudi Arabia, the kind of repression against journalists there, but they are still at a they're even further behind, I think, in Afghanistan and Iran right now. I think Ashish Dixit, who is from India, is also online. And I'd like to ask him to share his thoughts briefly. If Ashish, you could say hello, and so we can.
Hi.
There.
Yes.
Hi.
Can you,
yes,
can you
yes,
hear me?
Yes. Thank you so much. So thank you so much for joining, and can just say, like, just add to that.
Sure.
Yeah.
So thank you first of all, Beena, for letting me speak, and I wish I was there in person, but there are some problems. That's why I could not be there. But situation in India is not black and white. It's not that you cannot criticize the government. You can, but then it will be really, really difficult for you to find a platform. So what is happening is journalists who are critical of the current government, they have mostly been reduced to tweeting or running their own YouTube channels. They have lost, most of them have lost their jobs. So earlier they were basically talking to millions of people, and now maybe they are being heard or read by a few thousand people. So the situation in India is tricky in that way. So I don't know how much time I have got, but in a nutshell,
I think this is a really important point that you've made, Ashish, because I think that this is something we've seen in Pakistan also, journalists being taken off television who had outreach of a million different channels, but now like they're reduced to YouTube, digital, and of course.
So Beena, in just one line, I would like to say, I mean, trolling and all of those things do exist, and there are physical attacks as well. There is threatening of journalists, but largely what is happening is that basically Indian government can show it to the world that, hey, see, we have freedom of expression and people are able to criticize the government. But the reality is that even if we criticize the government, that does not reach a large section of India. What is reaching to the majority of Indians is basically what they refer to as Godi media, or the pro-government media, which is essentially the propaganda of the government.
Right, and just for people who don't know Hindi, Godi literally means lap. So the media that is considered to be the lap, sitting on the lap.
Sitting in the lap of the government. Yeah.
And as Kathy has just mentioned in the chat, that the journalists in several Central American countries are also under similar pressure. About, like, the entire Nicaraguan press corps is now working in exile, and blackballing, as Kathy said, is part of the dictator's handbook. So I'm going to now come back to Anuradha. I'm going to just come back to if we can have all the speakers on all our panelists on the spotlight, and just go around and just talk very briefly about the mistakes that we think that journalists make and how we can hold the line. If we can just go around really quickly, a minute or two each, and then we'll open it up to questions. People who are joining on Zoom can put their questions in the chat in the Facebook. They can put the questions in the chat. For people who are here in person, if we could have I think somebody's passing on index cards or something for questions. So people, so just write down your questions. We'll change our plan without letting me know. Okay. Okay. But first, I just want to go around very quickly to the panelists and ask Anuradha, Steve, Kathy, and Sabiha, and who's the fourth one? Sorry, I can't see.
Okay, may I?
Yes.
Okay, I think it's a very important question. Journalists are not perfect. As journalists, we do make mistakes, and we often do make mistakes. The thing is, one, you need to make amends as soon as you realize that you faltered in some reporting. The other thing now is, I think this whole focus on not just news gathering, but authenticating news. I'm glad, Stephen Butler pointed out the obvious, that, internet, which should have liberated us and led to freedom of the press, is actually making the scene much worse. But the same technology, again, I feel can be harnessed. And if you look at, I wouldn't be very pessimistic, because if you look at the whole evolution of freedom of speech, through thousands of years, there have been new technologies, and people have battled new technologies that have been used against people who wanted to speak out. And people who wanted to speak out did have to battle and find newer ways. And I think that's what our job should be. And one of the good things is that here, at least in the US, a lot of people are using artificial intelligence, but I wouldn't say place complete reliance on artificial intelligence to authenticate news, but do a combination of human and artificial intelligence for authenticating news. And that's something important. Okay, maybe later. Yeah, that's it.
And like in whichever order, I won't call on you, but just Steve, Kathy, Sabiha, if you want to
Okay,
add.
I'll jump in. To one of the last points, just on journalists not being perfect, and revealing that, I think that's very important. When I speak to audiences here in mid-Missouri, which is a place where a lot of people are very skeptical about journalism, and they ask me, how can I find a reliable source, a news source? I tell them, I say, I'm going to tell you something that might sound counterintuitive. And I say, does your news source have a corrections page, or do they carry corrections on their articles? Because if they do, they're a trustworthy source. Because to err is human, but to correct is professional. And so if you correct your errors, and if you are dealing with a news source that corrects their errors, you know that that organization and that reporter, that journalist, cares about their reputation. They care about the reputations of the people they are writing about, and they care about their credibility. And so they're not a fly-by-night crazy operation. So that's one of the tools I like to give people. And then I would say, on the larger question of what mistakes do we make, and this is definitely a big mistake that we in the United States have made, journalists in the United States. We've been too complacent. We have just assumed, I find that this chair that I occupy has been occupied by several people. And in the early days, I think the attitude was, well, we in America, it's our job to help our poor colleagues in other countries that don't have the same rights and freedoms we do. That's not the case anymore. We need to learn from you. We need to learn from people who are under threat in ways that we have never been under threat before, but we are now under threat. And that means being a lot less complacent. And if you look at the evolution of journalists' attitudes. I think you start with Marty Barron, the very accomplished and famous, just retired Washington Post editor, who, when Donald Trump was first elected and said he was at war with the media, Marty Barron very coolly answered, "We're not at war, we're at work." And I think in that quote was this idea, it was kind of this cool hand Luke, oh, we'll just do our jobs and that'll be enough. And a couple of months ago in New York, the International Press Institute had a gathering, and Marty's successor, Sally Busby, was on a panel, and she said, disinformation is the crisis of our times. So I think in between those two quotes, you can see a real movement much closer to what Maria Ressa, the gospel of Maria Ressa, which is in the war on facts, journalists must be activists. And I'll just say one other thing. The book that haunts me, there was a book that I read not many years ago. Many people read it in high school here, but I think it's kind of fallen off the program. It's an old book written in the 1930s by a journalist named Sinclair Lewis, an American journalist. And it's a novel. And the title of the novel is It Can't Happen Here. And of course, it is about the coming of dictatorship to America. And the anti-hero of the book is a small town newspaper editor who doesn't take a side until it's too late. And so that is one of those things. And believe me, I'm an old school journalist. I was brought up the old way, but I am having to really rethink a lot of things. And I think all of us are.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I'll just jump in myself for a second here, just to say that I think that we need to take the side of issues and not focus on personalities so much. We need to just, and I think that to do our job, to keep, we're not at war, we're at work. We just keep doing our work. They might be fighting with us. We're not fighting with them as individuals. We're fighting to, for the issues.
Yeah, but I think we have to, I think we have to get more proactive about telling people how we do our jobs, so that we need to educate people so that they recognize reported fact-based news and can tell the difference between that and to use the technical newsroom term, crap. And so we really need to help to be more active as educators of our audience.
Yes, I just on that, I want to say something that I've been wanting to do for some time, which I've talked to a lot of journalists about also, because now everybody who's on social media who has this device, a cell phone, can gather and share information that doesn't make them journalists. But like one of my students at Emerson College said some years ago, everybody should think like a journalist. So we need to train people to think like journalists, verify the two-source verification rule, to provide context, basically get the information and to focus on the facts and not get emotive about it. But Steve and Sabiha, if you'd like to add any words.
Yeah, I would just add, I think we need to be cognizant that the commercial incentives for media, and I'm not saying journalists necessarily, the commercial incentives for media often go against the kind of fact-based ethos. And journalists from Pakistan in particular, or other parts of Asia, they'll ask me sometimes, what can I do to protect myself? And I say, well, stick to the facts to begin with.
Right. Balance
your reporting, quote both sides. I mean, these are sort of the basics of journalism, but people who are making a splash on YouTube or elsewhere are often ignoring this. And unfortunately, everybody gets tarred by that same brush. I mean, I think that you have a model in the US of, you have Fox News versus MSNBC, which it's not necessarily, I mean, maybe American democracy can withstand that. In other places in the world, I don't know. It seems to me journalists just need to go back to the basics, and not easy to support that necessarily financially, but it's absolutely critical. I mean, that's a whole issue of how to support local journalism and fact-based journalism.
Exactly. I think this goes back to a point that a couple of people made earlier in this discussion, and that is that the real threat to journalism is the commercial realities. So, and that is connected to the digital revolution, because the digital revolution took away the advertising that subsidized journalism in so many countries for so long. Now, when you can micro-target somebody online, you don't need a full-page newspaper ad, or, which was the real moneymaker in the United States, the little classified ads that you now go onto Craigslist to see. So it put this huge hole in newspaper budgets. And now newspapers, I say newspapers because I'm a print journalist by trade, but legacy media operations are chasing readers in the same kind of low life, pimp my ride way that that the online platforms do. The online platforms have taught us that sensationalism and hate sell. And so you see legacy media operations falling. How do we get people, our audiences, to understand that they need more whole grains in their information diet, and so that they will support what we're doing?
Thank you, Sabir.
In my consideration, to keep on telling fact-based stories is the solution. And sometimes I think the Bangladeshi media has gone to the point like it's in an irreparable state currently, but I would love to see the rise of not-for-profit organizations in Bangladesh. We don't have any. I think that could be a possibility for journalists like us. And we must go beyond the personal lives. That's for me. That's my consideration. Thank you.
Yeah.
One thing I'd like to add is, in the Kashmir case that is happening, we're talking a lot about fact checking and verifying, which means, you need to cross check with different people. You need to go to the state. Well, the state becomes inaccessible. You go to the people. And probably people who have been impacted by a certain issue, and they are unwilling to talk because there is an overall pervading sense of fear. And even if they do, there have been cases where not just journalists are targeted, there are cases where people who spoke to the media were targeted. So that essentially is a huge problem. How do you then verify facts or get facts?
Okay, we're going to thank you, Anu, for that additional perspective. And it is obviously when a journalist speaks to someone who then gets targeted because they've spoken to that journalist, that puts so much responsibility on us, because sometimes those people can even be killed who've spoken to us. But I'm going to open it up to questions now. We have 10 minutes, I think 10 minutes for Q&A. So we started 15 minutes late, and so we're just going to go a little bit. So,
Bishop will, he has a question.
So, yeah. So if you would introduce yourself. And
Bishop Teixeira here in Massachusetts. I want us to move to fly a little bit to the Africa side of this world. I believe this is an international assault on journalism, period. It's not only in Asia, it's not here in America, in Latin America, it's all over the world. I had two experts traveling to Africa in 2018 and last year, again, one to Angola, one to Cape Verde. And I noticed the journalism in Africa, it's all bought by the government. There is no freedom of expression, even writing and so forth, even investigating, talking, and so on. I remember when they running my story, I was just looking at things, I said, but nobody talked to me. How did they? So never giving the person a chance to respond to the attacks and so forth. And I came to understand that they were forced to do what the government does.
wow.
And these are the governments who claim themselves to be democratic countries.
Yeah.
And my question is this, as we gather here, are going to bring are we going to bring these attention as a worldwide issue? Because I strongly believe, that we must face these as a whole, because only together we can do it. So this is my question.
Thank you. Thank you. No, I think your question actually already contains the answer, and actually we've already talked about that. So I don't think, I think as a thing at the point, the whole point of our discussion is to bring this as a polarization Africa, just because you're right in our talk, we had not mentioned Africa, and that's a very, very important point. But the point we're making, I think, is that this is a worldwide pattern that we are seeing. And we may or may not specifically mention countries, but it is definitely something that, and I think what we've talked about is that we need to go back to fact-based. But then how do we I don't know, how do we do that for our colleagues in Africa who actually
I've been killed and put in jail.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
So we don't have any, I don't think we have any easy answers, and nor can we claim that we will save the world or anything. All we can do is to draw attention to the issue, which we are trying to do. And hopefully people will write about this. I hope that people who are here, who are online, will write about it on their various platforms, on their social media platforms, and draw attention to the issue. And I think we can use the hashtag hold the line. Journalism hold the line, because what we're trying to do is to hold it. So thank you so much, Bishop, for your comments. Was there anybody, and if there's anybody online as well, so yeah, you can come here, because otherwise the speakers won't be able to hear you. Yeah, introduce yourself, please, and then.
Yeah, my name is Venkat Maraja. I live in the Boston area. I'm originally from Hyderabad, Telangana, back in India. So I know everybody, painting a very dire situation and a gloomy picture, right? I mean, that is, I think, as a journalism, traditional journalism has been under severe attack. I could see in India, and most of you were talking about federal government, but even the state governments. Okay, the state I come from, which is formed a new state, Telangana, which we all fought for it, was one of the best democratic movement of modern India.
Could I ask you to just make it really quick, because we have very little time?
Yeah, sure. I want to just to put the context, because see, the important thing is even the state governments have so much power they wield. The so-called, came from running a democratic movement, and we achieved the state, and now he becomes like one of the worst dictators we have seen in our states. Okay, and one of the things he does is his cronies go and buy all these channels, television channels. Okay, and so nobody is really there to report. This is a state level, but democracy and the people's new technologies have a way to express. And today, what is the situation is people like us hardly watch any TV news. See, these are journalists came out of these channels who were actually thrown out literally. Now they have YouTube channels. They are the biggest stars of our news. But and they were also put in jail actually. Yeah. One guy was filed. I mean, he's a very critical of the government. So they file every other week. So he's on the YouTube channel. He'll say, okay, police come sometimes on the live and say, okay, come, give me your this thing. So they file 35 cases. They put in jail, but they couldn't stop him. I mean, so while we're talking about traditional journalism, but there is, I think, this digital media and all has so much power to democratize and more vibrant, and also this little mobile device, not just these journalists, right? Every little thing happening anywhere is exposed, caught. So there is a new way to invent, the journalism and way to reach out the people. I mean, the way we know that traditionally is definitely under threat. So that's what I want to comment. Yeah.
It's not all bad. There's a lot of positive aspects to it as well. And I think what Anshada talked about earlier, the outreach, that the downside of that, of these people going on digital media, is the outreach is really not as much as it was, but it's better than nothing, right? Would anybody like to add anything to any of this? Or Yeah, because they are about to, I think we've got more minutes.
Thank you very much. Very
5 more
interesting,
minutes, yeah.
very interesting and excellent
Please
panel.
introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Shaheen Pirzada. I'm a resident of Cambridge. And Binaji had asked if what mistakes the journalists make. I just want to say journalists should not compromise on their principles. That's the basic thing. And I give you an example. Sabiji, I don't know the examples you gave about Bangladesh. I don't know if they were against the government or against the establishment, but I can only give examples of Pakistan because I'm from Pakistan. Recently, a Pakistani journalist was murdered in Kenya. Okay. And a certain TV channel and the journalists who were at one time harassed by the government and establishment, same person whose life was a danger when it was the previous government.
Shaheen, you need to ask your question because we've got 5 minutes.
None of them came to the help of the lady whose son was murdered. Okay. So they compromised on the principles because of this new government. That's my question, that they shouldn't do that.
Well, it's a very obvious, I think it's the question contains the answer within itself.
Yes, that's all I said.
Thanks very much. Yes, please. And then you.
So my name is Susan Gazal, and I'm a journalist from Brazil. And in June, Don Felix died in the rainforest in Brazil, in the Amazon, murdered under Bolsonaro's government. So I'm coming from a country that all my friends, my colleagues, they are constantly thinking about staying in the profession or leaving the profession. And they've been very brave to stay. And I think all the correspondents that go to live in Brazil know the risks they're going to face. And we had worst 4 years in democracy in Brazil from 2018 to 2020. But what I think that we should pay attention here is about accountability.
Yeah.
Because what's missing in social media or Facebook, Twitter, all the platforms, is that these trillionaires are commanding all the words. It's not only about Brazilian elite who gets all the newspapers and the television channels, the broadcasters, and what we can do in YouTube by ourselves. But while we worldwide don't talk about accountability, and all the fake news have been spread on all those social medias, WhatsApp, you name it, we are under threat. So it's not how much I can check and double check my sources, it's about who is behind all those trillions of fake news that are being spot on us every day.
So for that, I think again what Kathy and what Sabina, Steve, and Anuradha also talked about, the importance of verifying news before you forward it. So people who use social media need to verify news.
We need to have a word forum to make accountable all those people that are making trillions. I'm talking about Musk, I'm talking about Zuckerberg, I'm talking about the guys who are not accountable for what they're spreading.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you. And I didn't catch your name. I'm sorry.
Suzanne.
Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you, Suzanne. And we have the last question, and then we really have to just go around very quickly with the speakers and another couple of minutes. Yes.
Hi, my name is Ruth Keefson, and I'm not a journalist. I live here in Cambridge, and I teach at Bunker Hill. Hey, John. And I want to thank everybody for your work and your courage and this really interesting presentation. I think that the first speaker
from Kashmir.
she posed some questions.
Yes.
And I think that that there should be, which is how can we get rid of this system, this capitalist system? It's important though. It's important to raise that, and it should be. I think that all talks like this should be framed that way. I think that it's a mistake to frame it as democracy against autocracy, because we don't have democracy and we never have. And what's happening is capitalism is moving towards fascism all over the world. And I think that that's why that the question must be framed, of building a movement that gets rid of the whole system, that creates problems that it can't solve and creates chaos all over
Thank
the
you.
world.
Thank you so much. So I think your point about capitalism moving towards fascism is very well taken. It's kind of beyond the scope of this forum and beyond the scope of us as journalists to actually change the system. But we can only keep reporting on the facts. That's what I would say to that. We might, agree with you and want to change the system, but that's not. I think everybody should do their job, and that is not the journalist's job as such. That's my view. But if any of the panelists would like to respond to any of the comments that have come up, we have we're actually ending right now, we're over time, but if anybody wants to take.
I'll just quickly say that Maria Ressa's book really addresses a couple of points that were made here, including the whole question of, in some ways indirectly, the question of the capitalist road, but because really what we're talking about, the technology exists, as several of your questioners pointed out, and speakers, the technology exists to do journalism. And I think this is why, Steve talked about that there was this irrational exuberance that accompanied the dawn of the internet, where everybody thought, it's going to be great for democracy. And in a lot of ways it is. And where the exuberance really happened for journalists was over finally, we own the means of production. We can bypass the whole, all the white guys who you had to go through, because in order to be published back in the day, you had to get published on a printing press or go on air on a big antenna, which cost a lot of money. So it had to be owned by a rich person. The problem is the platforms are owned by rich guys too.
Yes.
It's an illusion that we own the means of production. And the way that comes to you first is you can go on YouTube or Facebook or Twitter and do your journalism. Who's going to pay you? We have got to figure out a way to make fact-based journalism pay again. And without that, we lose our journalists. So I think it is an important issue. And I think this is I tell my students at the University of Missouri, this is the moonshot for your generation. We have to figure this out.
Yeah, thank you, Kathy. Anuradha?
Yeah, just very quickly. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Just very quickly. Something that Kathy said about how she feels that Americans should have learned from rest of the world, not the other way around, as most journalists here would feel, taking the advantage position. And I can completely, identify with that, because in India about 10 years ago, we really didn't think that we would be here. But one of the few things that could be done, and there are no quick fix solutions. How are we going to change the system? But some of the things that we could do is look into, how business models could be changed, how disinformation could be combated. And one good thing would be networking, creating larger networks so that we can learn from each other. There are existing global inequalities. There are different experiences. And I think we could learn from each other how to hold the line.
Thank you so much, Anu. Steve, Sabina?
I was just going to say that I think that I think we've made a huge case for journalist education everywhere here and all around the world. And there are many programs that are quite good that are out there, but I think there's a really strong argument to try to expand them. And, there are successful models Rappler in the Philippines is a successful business, and there are other successful business, Malaysia, Kini, and all around the world. And I think that this is a very strong case for training journalists, training them how to do business, training them how to stay safe. Anyway, I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Steve. Sabina?
I think what Kathy said, that we all get good reporters if we all pay them better. This is number one. And number two is, I would love to see a strong network among reporters across the world. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. I think this is been a really useful discussion. Thank you all for the audience questions and for the comments in chat. Thank you, BSAC and colleagues at Sapan and BSAT for enabling this. We now end the Facebook Live and hope that we will take this, hope that everyone who's here takes forward these points that our speakers have raised. Like I said, use your platforms, social media platforms that you have to take these principles forward. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks to Beena for doing this and you know, you have journalists from Brazil, from Afghanistan, from Nepal, from India. It was like very amazing, and thanks for putting all the technology too. You were able to talk and do all like this. Yeah, and then thanks everyone, on the screen, off the screen, and we apologize for the initial, hiccups. Yeah, but thanks for your patience and thanks for educating all of us. And I hope we can take this forward in some way or the other.